This is a microphone, a Shure SM7B, the same model podcasters and broadcasters have used for decades. It costs about $400. It captures voice with clarity that makes listeners feel like the speaker is in the room with them. On January 27, 2026, at 9:47 p.m. Eastern, this microphone, or one exactly like it, captured something that wasn't supposed to be recorded. A private conversation between Michael Saylor, the chairman of MicroStrategy, and the largest individual corporate holder of Bitcoin in the world, and 3 institutional investors whose names I cannot disclose without legal consequence. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. The recording was made by one of the participants, presumably for their own notes, and portions were subsequently shared with a small network of crypto-focused analysts and fund managers. The sharing was not authorized. The content was not meant for public consumption. What Saylor said in those 47 minutes constitutes the most explicit warning about cryptocurrency's near-term future that any major holder has ever articulated. Not the hopeful projections he shares on podcasts, not the Bitcoin maximalist philosophy he preaches at conferences. The private assessment, the one he shares only with people managing billions in capital, paints a picture so different from his public persona that hearing it feels like discovering a second person has been speaking through his mouth. The warning is not that Bitcoin is going to zero. The warning is worse than that, because a crash you can see coming is a crash you can prepare for. What Saylor described is something else entirely, a transformation so fundamental that the Bitcoin most people think they own will cease to exist in any meaningful sense, while the Bitcoin a small minority actually owns becomes the most valuable asset on Earth. The divergence he's describing isn't theoretical, it's happening now. And if you don't understand the distinction he's making, if you don't act on his warning within the next 30 days, you may discover that your crypto holdings were never really yours to begin with. Here's what they're not telling you. Michael Saylor has spent 4 years building the most concentrated Bitcoin position in corporate history. MicroStrategy now holds over 471,000 Bitcoin, approximately 2.2% of all Bitcoin that will ever exist. At current prices, that position is worth over $46 billion. The company has borrowed billions to acquire this position, betting the entire enterprise on Bitcoin's continued appreciation. This context matters because Saylor's public statements serve a purpose, supporting the value of a position that represents MicroStrategy's entire balance sheet. Every bullish interview, every conference presentation, every social media post about Bitcoin being digital gold or pristine collateral supports an asset his company cannot afford to see decline. The private conversation on January 27th served a different purpose. Saylor wasn't marketing. He wasn't supporting his position. He was warning sophisticated investors about structural changes to cryptocurrency markets that his public persona cannot acknowledge without damaging the asset he's promoting. The warning centered on a single distinction that most crypto investors don't understand: the difference between Bitcoin you control and Bitcoin someone else controls on your behalf. The regulatory apparatus being constructed, Saylor said in the recording, doesn't distinguish between Bitcoin and claims on Bitcoin, but the distinction is everything. Within 18 months, possibly sooner, the Bitcoin held in custodial systems will be functionally different from Bitcoin held in self-custody. Not philosophically different, legally and operationally different. He continued, most people holding Bitcoin through exchanges and ETFs believe they own Bitcoin. They don't. They own a claim, a promise from an institution to honor redemption requests. That promise is about to become conditional in ways it has never been conditional before. The specific regulations Saylor referenced are already published, already scheduled for implementation, already transforming how institutional custody operates. The FinCEN rules taking effect February 5th impose surveillance requirements on exchange withdrawals. The SEC's custody framework for digital asset investment vehicles, finalized in January, grants regulators authority to restrict transfers under emergency conditions. The combination creates a regime where Bitcoin held in institutional custody exists under fundamentally different rules than Bitcoin held in personal wallets. The institutional Bitcoin can be monitored, restricted, frozen, and potentially redirected. The self-custodied Bitcoin remains outside this apparatus, at least for now. The window for moving from one category to the other, Saylor said, is measured in weeks, not months. After the regulatory infrastructure fully activates, moving from custodial to self-custody becomes surveilled, delayed, and potentially restricted. The transition has to happen before the restrictions take effect. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. The Bitcoin industry has marketed custody as a convenience, a service that removes the complexity of managing private keys while providing the same economic exposure to Bitcoin's price movements. The marketing was always partially false. Custodied Bitcoin has never provided the same properties as self-custodied Bitcoin. Censorship resistance, seizure immunity, permissionless transfer. These properties exist only for Bitcoin you actually control. Bitcoin on Coinbase is subject to Coinbase's policies. Bitcoin in an ETF is subject to the custodian's compliance obligations. But the partial falseness is becoming complete falseness. The regulatory framework being implemented doesn't just affect how custodians operate, it transforms what custodied Bitcoin actually is. Under the new framework, Bitcoin held in regulated custody is a financial asset subject to financial regulation. It can be frozen pursuant to legal process. It can be restricted during market emergencies. It can be subject to reporting requirements that link every transaction to an identified owner. Self-custodied Bitcoin remains something else, at least for now. It's property you control directly, transferable through cryptographic signature without institutional intermediation. The blockchain doesn't know or care about regulatory frameworks. The network processes transactions based on valid signatures, not compliance status. The paper versus physical distinction that has defined precious metals analysis for decades now applies to cryptocurrency with equal force. Custodied Bitcoin is paper Bitcoin, a claim on an asset, mediated by institutions, subject to their operational constraints and regulatory obligations. Self-custodied Bitcoin is physical Bitcoin, actual control, actual ownership, actual possession in the only sense that matters for a digital asset. Saylor's private warning was that the gap between these categories is about to widen dramatically. The premium for actual Bitcoin over claims on Bitcoin, he said, will emerge the same way it emerged for physical gold over paper gold. When people realize the claims can't be fully honored, when the restrictions reveal that custodied Bitcoin doesn't behave like self-custodied Bitcoin, the market will reprice the difference. The premium he's describing doesn't exist yet in explicit form. You can't look up a spot price for self-custodied Bitcoin versus ETF Bitcoin. Both trade at the same notional dollar value. Both appear identical in portfolio statements. But the premium exists implicitly in the behavior of sophisticated holders. Since January 15th, when the final FinCEN rules were published, exchange withdrawals to self-custody have exceeded 147,000 Bitcoin, the largest monthly outflow since the FTX collapse. The sophisticated money is converting claims to possession, while the conversion remains unrestricted. When institutions do what they're doing now, they're not speculating. They're positioning for a bifurcation they see approaching. At 11:30 a.m. Eastern on January 28th, MicroStrategy filed an 8K supplement with the SEC, disclosing changes to their Bitcoin custody arrangements. The filing revealed that MicroStrategy had migrated approximately 85,000 Bitcoin, roughly 18% of their total holdings, from institutional custodians to enhanced self-custody solutions utilizing multi-signature protocols with geographically distributed key management. MicroStrategy is moving Bitcoin to self-custody. The company whose chairman preaches Bitcoin adoption through institutional channels is quietly moving its own Bitcoin outside those channels. The behavior contradicts the rhetoric, or rather, reveals what the rhetoric is designed to obscure. The filing included language that analysts flagged immediately. The company believes that direct custody of digital assets provides enhanced security and operational flexibility compared to third-party custody arrangements, particularly in light of evolving regulatory requirements affecting custodial service providers. Evolving regulatory requirements affecting custodial service providers. MicroStrategy is telling you, in SEC-mandated disclosure, that they're moving to self-custody because of what's coming for institutional custody. They're acting on the warning Saylor delivered privately, while publicly maintaining the narrative that institutional Bitcoin is equivalent to self-custodied Bitcoin. The migration is ongoing. The filing noted that additional transfers to self-custody infrastructure were anticipated throughout Q1 2026. The largest corporate Bitcoin holder is systematically reducing exposure to the institutional custody system, while that system still functions normally. The timing is not coincidental. The FinCEN rules take effect February 5th. MicroStrategy's custody migration is scheduled to substantially complete before that date. They're crossing the bridge from custodial to self-custody, while crossing remains straightforward. Less than 30 days remain before the regulatory changes Saylor referenced become operational. The window he described in the private conversation, measured in weeks, not months, is the window closing right now. At 3:15 p.m. Eastern on January 29th, Fidelity Digital Assets, one of the largest institutional crypto custodians, published a client notice that received minimal media attention. The notice announced enhanced compliance protocols taking effect February 5th, including extended processing times for withdrawal requests exceeding $100,000 equivalent, and additional verification requirements for transfers to unhosted wallets. Unhosted wallets is regulatory language for self-custody, Bitcoin wallets that don't belong to a registered financial institution. Fidelity is announcing that moving your Bitcoin from their custody to your own wallet will become slower and more scrutinized starting February 5th. Coinbase published similar notice on January 30th. So did Kraken. So did Gemini. Every major U.S. exchange is implementing withdrawal friction that didn't exist previously, not because they want to, but because FinCEN requires it. The friction is designed to discourage self-custody. Each additional verification step, each extended processing time, each documentation requirement makes keeping Bitcoin on exchanges more convenient than taking custody yourself. The regulatory architecture guides behavior toward institutional custody, where Bitcoin can be monitored and controlled, away from self-custody, where it cannot. While Western exchanges implement restrictions, Eastern alternatives maintain access. At 8 a.m. Singapore time on January 29th, 7 p.m. Eastern the previous day, the Monetary Authority of Singapore published updated guidance for cryptocurrency businesses operating in the city-state. The guidance explicitly declined to implement withdrawal restrictions comparable to FinCEN requirements. Singapore exchanges will continue processing withdrawals to self-custody without the surveillance and delay that U.S. exchanges now impose. The regulatory arbitrage is immediate and obvious. Americans who want unrestricted Bitcoin access can establish relationships with Singapore-based exchanges. The withdrawal friction that U.S. regulators impose simply drives business to jurisdictions that don't impose equivalent friction. But the arbitrage requires action before February 5th. After that date, moving Bitcoin from U.S. exchanges to Singapore exchanges, or to self-custody, triggers the enhanced surveillance that makes movement less private and more conditional. The geographic bifurcation that Saylor referenced in his private warning is manifesting in real time. Regulatory competition, he said, will determine where Bitcoin actually exists versus where Bitcoin claims circulate. The jurisdictions that recognize the difference will attract the actual asset. The jurisdictions that don't will be left holding paper. Dubai has emerged as another alternative jurisdiction. The UAE's Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority explicitly permits unrestricted withdrawal to self-custody. Hong Kong, despite China's broader crypto restrictions, allows withdrawal without the surveillance requirements U.S. regulations impose. The Bitcoin is migrating, not just from exchanges to wallets, but from restrictive jurisdictions to permissive ones. The 147,000 Bitcoin that left exchanges in January didn't just change custody status. Much of it changed geographic nexus, establishing presence in regulatory environments that respect the distinction between claims and possession. The BRICS dimension compounds the jurisdictional shift. At the January summit in Kazan, the finance ministers' session on digital assets produced language that Western analysts have parsed carefully. Member states recognize that self-custody of digital assets represents sovereign individual property rights, not subject to routine institutional monitoring, absent specific legal process. The BRICS bloc is codifying protection for self-custody, while the West imposes surveillance on it. The regulatory divergence creates two cryptocurrency ecosystems. One where Bitcoin operates as designed, censorship-resistant, permissionless, self-sovereign, and one where Bitcoin operates as a surveilled financial asset, distinct from traditional instruments only in its technical architecture. Saylor's warning addressed which ecosystem will hold value. The Bitcoin that retains the properties that make Bitcoin valuable, he said, is the Bitcoin that operates outside surveillance infrastructure. The Bitcoin that becomes just another monitored financial asset loses the premium that comes from being something different. This is what a system looks like when it reaches a bifurcation point. The regulatory changes taking effect in February don't ban Bitcoin. They don't make self-custody illegal. They create a two-tier system where institutional Bitcoin and self-custodied Bitcoin become functionally different assets with different properties and, eventually, different prices. The trap has no clean exit for those who wait too long. After February 5th, converting from custodial to self-custody creates records in surveillance databases. The addresses you withdraw to become known, linked to your identity, trackable through the blockchain's permanent transaction history. Before February 5th, conversion creates minimal records under current rules. The withdrawal appears as a standard transaction. The receiving address isn't automatically reported to FinCEN. The link between your identity and your self-custody wallet remains private, at least from government surveillance. The privacy difference matters enormously. Self-custody Bitcoin that authorities know you control isn't fully self-sovereign. It's subject to legal process, asset seizure, and compliance pressure that operates through you rather than through a custodian. Self-custody Bitcoin that authorities don't know about retains the properties that make self-custody valuable. The last clean exit window, Saylor said in the recording, closes when the surveillance infrastructure activates. After that, you can still move to self-custody, but you do so with a spotlight following you. The choice becomes known self-custody or unknown institutional custody. Neither is ideal. The people who moved before February have a third option: unknown self-custody. Unknown self-custody is what MicroStrategy is establishing through its custody migration. The company's Bitcoin exists in wallets they control, managed through protocols that provide security without requiring external verification. The 85,000 Bitcoin they've migrated doesn't depend on Coinbase's compliance decisions or Fidelity's processing times. The question for individual holders is whether to follow MicroStrategy's behavior or MicroStrategy's rhetoric. The rhetoric says institutional adoption is good, ETFs are progress, custody solutions are legitimate. The behavior says move to self-custody now, before the rules change. Believe the behavior. The 30-day window Saylor referenced is not arbitrary. It's the time remaining before February 5th, plus the processing time required for large withdrawals under current rules. A withdrawal initiated today clears before the new rules take effect. A withdrawal initiated in 2 weeks may not. The exchange processing times, currently 1 to 3 days for most withdrawals, will extend under the new framework. The enhanced compliance protocols require additional review, additional documentation, additional delay. What takes 2 days now may take 2 weeks in February. The math is straightforward. If you want to move Bitcoin to self-custody before surveillance begins, you have roughly 30 days. If you wait until late February, you're moving under the new rules, with the new delays, with the new records created for every transaction. Those who understand the distinction Saylor articulated are not waiting. The 147,000 Bitcoin exodus since January 15th represents understanding translated into action. The MicroStrategy custody migration represents corporate understanding translated into corporate action. The retail holders who hear Saylor's public interviews, who believe institutional Bitcoin is equivalent to self-custodied Bitcoin, don't understand what sophisticated holders understand. The asymmetry of information creates asymmetry of positioning. The sophisticated exit while the unsophisticated hold paper. The question is not whether Bitcoin will appreciate, the long-term case remains intact. The question is which Bitcoin you'll hold when the appreciation occurs. Institutional Bitcoin that can be frozen, restricted, and surveilled, or self-custodied Bitcoin that retains the properties that created the appreciation case in the first place. Reality asserts itself through regulatory calendars that advance regardless of understanding. February 5th arrives whether you've prepared or not. The surveillance infrastructure activates whether you've moved to self-custody or not. The bifurcation between paper Bitcoin and physical Bitcoin emerges whether you recognize it or not. Saylor's public persona will continue promoting Bitcoin adoption, institutional integration, and regulatory compliance. His public statements serve his company's need to support the value of its holdings within the legitimate financial system. His private warning serves a different purpose, alerting sophisticated investors that the legitimate financial system is about to create second-class Bitcoin, surveilled, restricted, conditional, while first-class Bitcoin remains available only to those who understood the distinction in time. The warning was not supposed to be public. The recording was not supposed to circulate. The strategy that MicroStrategy is implementing, moving to self-custody while publicly promoting institutional custody, was not supposed to be visible. But it is visible now. The 8K filings document the migration. The exchange notices document the coming restrictions. The FinCEN rules document the surveillance architecture. Everything Saylor said privately is verifiable through public sources. You just have to know where to look. The microphone captured what the marketing obscures. The private assessment contradicts the public promotion. The behavior reveals what the words conceal. Michael Saylor's warning is that most people don't see what's next for crypto. They don't see the bifurcation approaching. They don't see that the Bitcoin they hold through institutions will become something different from the Bitcoin they could hold themselves. The warning is not that Bitcoin will fail. The warning is that paper Bitcoin will emerge as a separate, inferior asset, while physical Bitcoin, self-custodied, self-controlled, self-sovereign, becomes the only Bitcoin that delivers what Bitcoin promised. 30 days remain. The window Saylor described is closing. The migration he's executing is underway. The warning he delivered privately is now delivered to you. The question is what you do with it. The exchanges still process withdrawals under the old rules, for now. The self-custody tools still work as designed, for now. The opportunity to establish unknown self-custody still exists, for now. For now expires February 5th. The recording lasted 47 minutes. The warning was clear. The action required is simpler than understanding why it's required. Move your Bitcoin to wallets you control. Do it before the rules change. Do it before the surveillance activates. Do it before the window closes. That's the warning most don't see. That's what's next for crypto. Not price predictions, not adoption curves, not institutional acceptance narratives. The bifurcation between Bitcoin you own and Bitcoin someone else controls on your behalf, and the permanent consequences of being on the wrong side when the rules change. Saylor sees it. MicroStrategy is acting on it. The sophisticated money is moving. The 30-day window is open. What you do with it determines which Bitcoin you hold through everything that follows. The microphone captured the truth. Now you've heard it too.